So, you still think we'd all be better off if we could just give each other the straight objective facts, huh? Well, let's see what our old friend Kenneth Burke has to say about that. Kenneth Burke is known as one of the most prominent rhetorical critics of the 20th century. He wrote prolifically during his career, and his works have had a lasting influence on the study of rhetoric and other related fields. While there is plenty that we can and probably will say about his many works, our focus today is on his essay Semantic and Poetic Meaning, which appears in the 1941 collection The Philosophy of Literary Form. While Burke's writing has a reputation for being a bit convoluted at times, Semantic and Poetic Meaning, I think, sits on the more straightforward and engaging side of that line. So not only have the ideas in that essay proven really useful to me as I've thought about writing and language over the years, but I think the essay itself is one that I would say is worth reading. Burke begins by saying this essay may be taken as a rhetorical defense of rhetoric. It is intended to give support to the thesis that the ideal of a purely neutral vocabulary, free of emotional weightings, attempts to make a totality out of a fragment. In other words, this piece is a response to the old complaint among philosophers, scientists, and others that language is too imprecise and messed up by things like human subjectivity and emotions to be a very useful tool. As will become clear, though, Burke wasn't too convinced that a purely neutral language was such a good idea. At the very least, he thought it was a pretty limiting idea. So, with all that in mind, I'd like to spend some time today talking about Burke's ideas of semantic and poetic meaning. First, in order to understand his essay more fully, but also to talk about what those ideas mean for us as writers. Of course, if you're interested in learning more about the theory and practice of good writing, be sure to subscribe so that you'll always know when the latest videos have been released. And without further delay, let's get into it. Introducing the concept of semantic meaning, Burke starts out by talking about the postal system. The mail works, he says, because every recipient has a unique address. There's a system in place with house numbers, street names, and zip codes that all work together to allow the postal system to know where to send each piece of mail. If you fill out the envelope completely with the address, you know where it's going to end up. So Burke explains that the semantic ideal aims to evolve a vocabulary that gives the name and address of every event in the universe. That is, just as each mailing address identifies a unique recipient, the semantic ideal is after a language where each word refers explicitly and specifically to only one thing. Now, the mail system wouldn't work if there could be two houses with the same address, and it also would be pretty confusing if the same house could have two different addresses. For an optimally efficient postal system, there has to be one address for one recipient. That way, you can clear up any confusions or misunderstandings before they happen. If we took the semantic ideal to its logical conclusion in language, then we wouldn't be able to use the word bank to refer both to the sides of a river and to the place where we keep money. Nor would we be able to have one group of people call a politician's speech a promise while another group called it a threat. Per the semantic ideal, each unique thing, event, or idea would have only one word that refers to it. What's more, the semantic ideal aims at a system of language that only operates on the basis of being true or false. In an ideal postal system, the mail would either get delivered to the correct recipient or it wouldn't. In an ideal semantic language system, a statement would only be true or false. You wouldn't be able to say that something was technically true or that something was true from a particular point of view. On the face of it, that probably sounds pretty good. Imagine if you were speaking a language where nobody could ever misunderstand you or take what you were saying in the wrong way. It's probably at least as good as never getting mail delivered to your apartment for people who moved out a long time ago. And the semantic ideal certainly has its advantages. There are, in fact, times when we want to make clear, unambiguous references to things within a system of meaning. As Burke explains, the vocabulary of chemistry, for instance, may be much the same for the communist, fascist, and liberal. A theory of ballistics may be couched in one set of symbols, whether it is to be studied by progressives or reactionaries. It would be much harder to do chemistry if everybody had different words for compounds or a different understanding of what ions were. For certain tasks, the semantic ideal really is ideal. But the semantic ideal does have its limitations, and Burke points out two significant issues you'll run into if you pursue the semantic ideal too aggressively. The first is that semantic meaning really only works if there's already a system of meaning in place. The address on an envelope is only meaningful in the context of the postal system. That is, your mailing address only identifies you correctly if there's already an organization that recognizes zip codes and street names. Without that system, your address isn't very useful. So while your mailing address refers ideally only to you, it's not going to work if you step outside of that organizing system and, for example, go camping for a weekend. Even with your unique address, that letter isn't going to get delivered to your tent. So, as Burke points out, the semantic ideal assumes an organization. Its meaning, then, is in the instructions it gives for the performance of desired operations within this going concern. So your mailing address provides valuable information for the postal worker who's trying to get your mail to the right address, but it only works, again, within that pre-existing context of meaning. You could label an envelope and say, please deliver this to the green house across the street from the Browns, and all of that information would be true, but it wouldn't work because the system that already exists isn't equipped to deal with that kind of meaning. Semantic meaning depends on a system, and because of that, it is only equipped to deal with the kinds of meaning that that system was built for in the first place. Step outside of that system and the whole thing is going to fall apart. And Burke illustrates that by pointing out that a mailing address is not able to account for the full sense of a person. Saying of a particular man, he means one thing to his family, another to his boss, another to his underlings, another to his creditors, etc. So the semantic ideal can tell you precisely and unambiguously where you live, but of course there's more to you than your mailing address. And the semantic ideal is totally unable to say anything about all of that. So if you're after a more complex understanding of who you are, and not just of where you live, you're going to need something more than the semantic ideal. In contrast to the semantic ideal, Burke proposes the poetic ideal. Now, he does not claim that these two ideals are opposites, just that they're different, but he does acknowledge that we have a tendency to see differences as opposites. At any rate, where the semantic ideal is unambiguous and highly functional within an existing system of meaning, the poetic ideal throws itself into the ambiguities and complexities of meaning. So, while the semantic ideal operates to get a letter to you and only you, the poetic ideal seeks to understand and communicate the full, complex set of meanings that make you up. As Burke writes, the first would try to cut away, to abstract all emotional factors that complicate the objective clarity of meaning. The second would try to derive its vision from the maximum heaping up of all these emotional factors, playing them off against one another, and seeking to make this active participation itself a major ingredient of the vision. So, for example, if you were to ask me what the Thanksgiving holiday means to me, I could give you two kinds of answers. Pursuing the semantic ideal, I could tell you that Thanksgiving to me is nothing more nor less than the fourth Thursday of November. Based on that response, you could unfailingly identify Thanksgiving on any calendar. Pursuing the poetic ideal, though, I would heap up all the emotional factors, all the memories and feelings and experiences that go into my understanding of Thanksgiving. So I would have to talk about the Thanksgivings of my childhood, which usually involved going to my grandparents' house, being around extended family, going bowling while the turkey cooks, and drinking cherry 7-Up in between turns. I would have to talk about the glass dish full of pickles and olives that the grown-ups ate, and watching my grandpa carve the turkey with a buzzing electric knife. But it wouldn't stop there. I would also have to talk about my first Thanksgiving when I was living in Brazil. Sitting down on a regular old Thursday to a plate of black beans and rice with a glass of icy cold lime juice, while I dabbed sweat from my brow and imagined my family half a world away wearing sweaters and eating pie. Of course, I would also have to tell you that my understanding of Thanksgiving is informed by one that I spent at a friend's house in Oregon. That day ended with a trip to feed baby cows. And then there are the Thanksgivings in Ohio. There was one that I spent with friends at church. The Tuesday before, somebody had crashed into a power line, and it made us wonder whether the church was being haunted by monsters from another dimension. There was another where a group of people met at a teacher's house. I took a cranberry pie. The day included a walk to an old covered bridge, and a drawing contest instigated by one of my teacher's daughters. She said that whoever drew the best person would win a prize, so naturally I drew Batman, the best person I could think of, and I won handily. Clearly, this is much more information than you'd get with the semantic ideal, and admittedly, none of it is very useful if all you want to know is when to start defrosting the turkey. But the poetic ideal is not just interested in giving you information that will be valuable in the future. The poetic ideal is about involving you in a meaningful experience right now. As Burke says, this poetic meaning would contain much more than pragmatic, positivistic, futuristic values. A fully moral act is basically an act now. A fully moral act is a total assertion at the time of the assertion. Among other things, it has a style, and this style is an integral aspect of its meaning. You would get the same semantic definition of Thanksgiving no matter who you asked, but a poetic definition of Thanksgiving would vary from person to person over time. Thus, the semantic ideal envisions a vocabulary that avoids drama. The poetic ideal envisions a vocabulary that goes through drama. On the one hand, we have a system that seeks to deliver the minimum useful fact for accomplishing a certain task, and on the other, we have an approach to meaning that seeks to involve us in the full complexity of a meaningful experience. So, after outlining the purely objective semantic ideal and the richly messy poetic ideal, and also taking a detour through Greek drama like he sometimes does, Burke spends some time talking about why it all matters, and discussing what is at stake in the tensions between these two ideals. Again, it's worth pointing out that Burke does not see these two ideals as opposites. They're different, but they are not mutually exclusive. Now, we do need to make choices when we write, and Burke's concluding reflections can give writers some useful guidance. He says, information is quite often semantically sound, but it is rarely resonant. The percentage of such stuff has become too high. Unawares, we have allowed ourselves to take it as the norm, thereby confusing a norm with an average. That is to say that in our modern obsession with pure facts, we've surrounded ourselves with information that nobody really cares about. Burke is saying, essentially, that the semantic ideal, while capable of producing reliable truth in a particular context, is also really good at producing dry, boring reading. And obviously that's something that we want to be aware of as we write. If our writing is so dull that we drive readers away, it's not going to matter how sound our facts are. A text that nobody reads is as good as no text at all. Culturally, we prize objective facts, but we have to acknowledge their limitations. A semantic definition of Thanksgiving is useful if we're trying to figure out our calendars, but it's not going to help us get to know each other and the world we live in with the same kind of depth and complexity as a poetic definition. If we imagine our readers as empty computer boxes ready to receive information from our writing, we're denying the reality that all people, yes, even scientists and philosophers, have feelings, attitudes, and personalities. So it's important for us to be aware of our readers' humanity and to leverage the poetic ideal in making our good facts interesting and engaging. Semantic truths probably won't inspire people, but poetic truths do have the capacity to move people to action. Burke then says, I am asking simply that the temper of our enlistment undergo a change of emphasis, that the norm of our tone cease to be the insulting tone that talks down to people. Nor would it be a presumptuous tone that laid claim to uplift them, but rather a tone that would plead with us all, with the writer to as well as the written to. In it, there must also be disdain for those who have been giving the final insult to democracy, as they contrive to suggest that one almost has a moral obligation to write trivially and superficially, as though one could only show a proper love of mankind by plying the citizenry with flimsy items to be used once and thrown away. Essentially, Burke asks his readers not to be objective know-it-alls, not to consider themselves noble heroes helping out the commoners, and not to go about acting like their plain, lifeless writing is somehow morally superior because it is boring and dry. Elsewhere, he complains that we're too quick to give scientific immunity to bad writing because, well, it must be true if it's boring. Burke asks us really to do better by our readers. For me, the distinction between semantic and poetic meaning is one that highlights the importance of writing things that people will want to read. It's not enough just to write things that are true. It's important to write things that are interesting. And if we understand the poetic ideal, we understand that bringing our readers along with us through the complexities and experiences that inform our writing will go a long way to deepen their understanding and appreciation of what we're trying to say. So Burke concludes by saying the ideal word is in itself an act. Its value contained in its use at the moment of utterance. Its worth does not reside in its usefulness and promise, though that is certainly part of it, but in its style as morals, as petition, in the quality of the petition, not in the success of the petition. Thus, the real takeaway for you and for me is that we ought to pay attention not just to what we're telling our readers, but also to the experiences that we're creating for them. Yes, there is value in what readers do with the things that we tell them somewhere down the road, but there is also a lot at stake in the qualities of the experiences that our readers are having as they read. So are we treating them like robots or people? Are we giving them useful facts? Are we exposing them to new and meaningful experiences? Are we hiding our biases with artificially bone-dry prose? Or are we letting the complexities of our writing come forward? Obviously, each situation will call for a different strategy, but we ought to be aware that there is always more at stake than just the facts. So there you have it, a quick tour of the highlights of Kenneth Burke's Semantic and Poetic meaning. If our discussion today was an experience that you thought was worth having, let us know by liking the video. If you have any thoughts or questions, leave them in the comments, and let us know if there are any texts you'd like to discuss in the future. And of course, do your part to enrich the complex poetic meaning of this video by sharing it with a friend. Thanks for watching. Now go write some amazing things until we meet again.